My grandfather was a British soldier in the Second World War. He was only about 19 years old when he joined, and while he thought serving his country would give him opportunities to see exotic locations around the world, he wasn't sent to Tunisia or the Pacific. No, he ended up in Switzerland. Now, I know what you're thinking. Switzerland was neutral in the war. Well, that's true. However, the Allied and Axis nations didn't really respect that very much. And while Switzerland never fought openly, there was fighting done. I wasn't there. I'm only telling my grandfather's story. So once the Nazis began committing acts of aggression against Switzerland, England provided reinforcements to the Swiss military. Yet, in an effort to prevent open war within its borders, the Swiss government instructed its military, and subsequently the British reinforcements, to perform a series of tactical retreats into the Alps. That's how my grandfather found himself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. At this time, it's early in the winter of 1943, and my grandfather's company is stationed in a secluded village of... I can't remember the name. About 500 people live there, though. Now, the advantage to this location is that it's really hard to get to, so therefore, you have very little chance of being attacked. But this is a disadvantage because communications is damn near impossible. And the issue with communication is just made worse when sometime in early December, a series of blizzards sweeps through the region, completely destroying the few lines of communication that they have. So essentially, trapped in this isolated Swiss village without being able to make contact with the rest of the army, my grandfather's commanding officer decided it would be best to uphold the standing orders and continue defending the village. Several weeks pass. Any roads to the outside are buried under close to 10 feet of dense snowfall, and any telegraph lines that they had were completely useless. It grew deeper into winter. The leaves were stripped from the trees, the bare trunks protruded from the mountainside like broken ribs. But the town was nestled between two large mountains, so sunlight only directly reaches the town for just a few hours each day. So everyone feels as though they're living in a state of perpetual dusk. Now, one night, my grandfather is at the town bar with a few of his buddies from the company, and a group of locals approached them. One of them in particular was visibly upset. All of the Swiss people in the town grew up speaking German, I guess. And none of them were used to having Brits around, so English wasn't very common. So the visibly upset one comes up to my grandfather and says, "Where take you the children?" Luckily, one of the soldiers with my grandfather spoke German well enough to translate. And after several minutes of confusion and yelling and crying, the translator turns to my grandfather and the other soldiers and says, some of the village children have gone missing, and they want us to do something about it. Now, obviously, the British military doesn't exactly act as a bunch of mercenaries for hire. So, my grandfather and his friends tell the villagers to come back to headquarters, which is really just makeshift barracks they made at the town's church. They're going to talk to the commanding officer. Now, due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain took a couple hours. And basically, what the captain and his self-designated translator were able to piece together was this. A few weeks after the company entered the village, the locals noticed a variety of incidents. At first, it was just benign stuff like vanishing pieces of wood, and vanishing tarps from people's sheds. But it eventually became more and more. An axe was taken, a shovel, a pistol with some ammo, blankets. The culmination of all of these incidents was a village child went missing. Now, naturally, we just assume that the child's disappearance, although tragic and disconcerting, could be attributed to something as simple as a boy falling into a snowdrift while playing outside, or horribly being killed by a wolf. But they explained to us that it wasn't just one child that disappeared. There were several. The villager who entered the bar looking especially upset, that was the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing the day before. He had searched everywhere for them. He even rounded up a posse of townspeople, but they didn't have a single clue as to what happened to the children. The captain told the villagers that he would continue to look into the matter, and that he would begin adding more men to patrol, so that each night they could look for whoever or whatever was behind all the incidents. Later that night, Private Reginald Coffey disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man? It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down Reggie. Naturally, rumors began to surface with the townsfolk that a monster was living in the mountains, while privates were convinced it was the Nazis. Despite the nightly patrols ordered by the captain, the disappearances kept occurring. Reginald was the only adult victim of whatever was preying on the village. The rest of the victims were all young children between the ages of 5 and 10. All in all, including the 3 original kids, 7 children and 1 soldier had vanished from the town. Now, several people in the company were starting to grow suspicious. One of the explanations that was passed around was that the impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to traffickers for extra cash. But that never made sense to Grandfather. The roads in and out of town were blocked by snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident. But at this point, it's early spring, and the snow is starting to thaw. That night, coincidentally, when my grandfather was on patrol, with several other soldiers, they discovered what was behind the children and Reginald's disappearances. It was sometime past midnight when Grandpa and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' houses. My grandfather was at the opposite end of the street, so at first the figure looking through the window didn't see the patrol. But my grandfather and the other soldiers yelled at the prowler, and it immediately began running away. Everyone in the patrol was certain that this was who was behind the disappearances and the break-ins. They ran as fast as they could in pursuit, through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, screaming, "Halt! Stop!" They kept running and running, and soon they found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still fairly deep, and the figure jumped into the ground. It looked like it had vanished into thin air at first. But as they got closer, they realized that the prowler had actually just jumped into a cave of sorts that had been hollowed out in the side of a snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began yelling into the cave for the figure to come out, they heard several gunshots. Without thinking, all the men on patrol shouldered their weapons and began firing into the hole. And then there was silence. They waited for what seemed like hours, but was really just a couple of minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and investigate. He drew his pistol, kneeled down, and crawled in. Several minutes later, he emerged with a horrified expression on his face. Grandpa took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave. When he saw the gruesome explanation behind all the incidents in town, the figure they'd been chasing was Reggie. You know, the private who had gone missing weeks before. They had shot Reginald right in the head. But the cave was not only occupied by Reggie. No. It had the bodies of 7 partially eaten children. Either due to the stress of being snowed in all winter, living in near constant darkness, or some terrible mental issue. Reggie had gone completely batshit insane and had begun breaking into villagers' homes and snatching their children and eating them.